Beloved, we all know the story of the Exodus, the liberation of the Israelites from centuries of slavery in Egypt. But what if I told you this isn't just a story about ancient people in an ancient land? What if I told you that the Exodus is not confined to the history books? It's not just a story for the Israelites, but a divine pattern that speaks to each and every one of us today. The Exodus is a message of deliverance, transformation, and hope. It shows us the power of God's intervention and His desire to move us from bondage into freedom, from despair into destiny. The cry of oppression. The story of the Exodus begins with the Israelites crying out from the depths of their oppression. For hundreds of years, they had lived as slaves in Egypt, subjected to the harshest conditions and forced to work tirelessly under the oppressive rule of Pharaoh. Their cries were not just expressions of physical pain, but also a deep, soul-wrenching plea for freedom. Freedom from the weight of injustice, from the crushing force of slavery, from the daily grind that stripped them of their dignity and their humanity. And yet, for so long, it seemed that their cries were unheard, as if the heavens themselves were silent. But we must understand this. Even in their silence, God was listening. Their pain did not go unnoticed. Their suffering was seen by the Creator of the universe. Oppression, in its truest form, is not merely the absence of freedom. It is the systematic stripping away of everything that makes us who we are. It forces us into a mold, stripping us of our identity, our sense of self, and our connection to God. The Israelites were not just physically enslaved, they were spiritually and emotionally bound by their circumstances. Their hope had been crushed. Their spirit had been broken. They lived in a world where their future seemed bleak, and their existence was reduced to mere survival. It's in this context that we find the cry of the Israelites. It wasn't just a cry of despair. It was a cry of defiance, a cry of desperation, a cry that said, "We are more than this. We are more than what this world says we are." Their cry for deliverance wasn't just for a change in circumstances. It was a cry for restoration. Deep within them, they knew that they were meant for something greater than slavery. God had promised their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that they would become a great nation, that they would possess a land of their own, a land flowing with milk and honey. But for generations, they had been trapped in Egypt, and the hope of that promise seemed like a distant dream. Yet, even in the deepest moments of despair, something within them still believed that God had not forgotten them. There was still hope, even if it was a flicker in the dark. Their cries were a call to God to remember His promises, to act on behalf of His people, to bring them out of bondage and into the freedom He had promised them. The cry of oppression resonates with us today in so many ways. We may not be in physical chains like the Israelites, but many of us live in the chains of emotional, mental, and spiritual bondage. We are burdened by the weight of our struggles, be it poverty, systemic injustice, emotional wounds, or the pressure to conform to the standards of this world. We cry out in our own way, asking for freedom, asking for a way out, asking for deliverance. Like the Israelites, we often feel like our cries go unheard, like the heavens are silent, and our suffering is invisible. But we must take heart, because just as God heard the Israelites' cries, He hears ours. His ears are not closed, and His heart is moved by our pain. There is a deep truth in the cry of the oppressed. It is not just a plea for survival. It is a call for transformation. It is a call to move from where we are to where we are meant to be. Just as the Israelites' cries reached the heart of God, so do ours. When we cry out, we are not simply asking for a change in our external circumstances. We are asking for a change in our very essence, for a shift from slavery to freedom, from despair to hope, from darkness to light. Our cries are not futile. They are the opening of a door for God to enter into our situation and bring about change. In the case of the Israelites, their cries were not just heard, they were answered. God did not forget them, and just as He responded to their cries with the promise of deliverance, He promises us that our cries too will be met with His intervention. The process of liberation begins with the cry. It is the acknowledgement of our need for change, for freedom, for a breakthrough. It is an act of faith, a declaration that we believe that God is able to intervene, that He is a God of deliverance, and that He will not leave us in our suffering forever. Our cries may seem like whispers in the wind, but they are mighty before the throne of God, and He will move heaven and earth to bring us to a place of freedom. The cry of oppression is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of something greater. It is the first step toward deliverance. When we cry out, we acknowledge our dependence on God and our trust that He will respond. He has heard our cries, and He is already at work, preparing the way for our liberation. God's response, raising a deliverer. When the Israelites cried out in their oppression, their suffering reached the ears of God. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who had made promises to their ancestors, had not forgotten His people. Though they had been in Egypt for generations, and their cries seemed to go unanswered, God's response was always imminent, and He had a plan in place. It was not enough for God to hear their pain. He was determined to act. He was going to raise up a deliverer, someone who would bring His people out of bondage, and lead them toward the freedom and promise that He had sworn to them. This deliverer, Moses, would become the instrument through which God would show His power, His faithfulness, and His divine purpose. Moses' story begins with an unlikely and humble origin. Born into a family of Hebrews, at a time when Pharaoh had commanded the death of all male Hebrew children, Moses was spared. His mother, in an act of desperation but also faith, placed him in a basket and set him afloat on the Nile River. Pharaoh's daughter found him, and Moses was raised as a prince of Egypt, unaware of his true identity. While Moses grew up in the palace, he was always a Hebrew in his heart. He was a man divided between two worlds, one of privilege and one of suffering. In his early adulthood, he witnessed the brutality of the Egyptians toward his people, and in a moment of impulsive anger, he killed an Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew slave. Moses fled Egypt in fear, seeking refuge in Midian. For many years Moses lived in exile, tending to the sheep of his father-in-law Jethro. He seemed to be removed from the great mission that God had for him. From the outside, it seemed like Moses was forgotten, that his moment had passed. He was shaping Moses, preparing him for the great calling that lay ahead. In the wilderness, Moses learned humility. He learned patience. He learned the importance of trusting God's timing. It was in that place of quiet obscurity that God began to prepare Moses for the incredible journey that was about to unfold. Then, at the age of 80, God called Moses from a burning bush. This moment was profound, not just because of the miraculous nature of the bush that burned, but did not consume, but because it marked the beginning of Moses' calling. God spoke to Moses, calling him to go back to Egypt and deliver his people. God told Moses that he had seen the misery of the Israelites, and now was the time for their deliverance. Moses, initially reluctant, asked, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" He felt unqualified, inadequate, and unsure of his abilities. But God reassured him, saying, "I will be with you." God's response to Moses' hesitation was not a rebuke, but a promise. He didn't ask Moses to rely on his own strength or abilities. He asked Moses to trust in him, to be obedient, and to follow where he led. This moment is crucial, because it reminds us that God does not always call the most qualified or the most capable. He calls those who are willing. Moses was not a perfect man. He had a past filled with mistakes and regrets. But God still chose him. This is the essence of God's grace. He uses imperfect people to accomplish His perfect will. The raising up of Moses as a deliverer is a testimony to God's sovereignty and faithfulness. Moses was not the only one called to deliverance, but he was the vessel through which God would bring liberation to a nation. God's call to Moses shows us that His plans are often bigger than we can imagine. Moses thought his life was over when he was exiled in Midian, but God had not finished with him. This is a reminder for all of us. No matter how far we may feel from our purpose, no matter how disqualified we feel, God is always at work behind the scenes. He is always preparing us for what He has called us to do, even in the quiet and hidden places of life. As Moses stood before God, unsure of his worthiness, God assured him that His presence would be enough. "I will be with you. God promised. This assurance is the foundation of every calling that God gives. We are not called to succeed on our own strength or understanding, but to trust in the power of God. Moses' story is a testament to the reality that God calls us, not because of our own abilities, but because he knows that his strength will be made perfect in our weakness. God's response to the Israelites' cries wasn't just to send a deliverer, it was to initiate a plan of salvation that would span generations. Through Moses, God would display his power, his justice, and his mercy in ways that would leave an eternal mark on history. And just as Moses was called for a purpose, so are we. Each of us has a calling, a role to play in God's grand narrative. And even when we feel inadequate, God will raise us up and equip us to fulfill his plan. Just as he was with Moses, he will be with us. And when we are obedient, we will witness God's power at work in our lives and the lives of those we are called to serve. The Red Sea, crossing over into the unknown. The moment when the Israelites stood before the Red Sea is one of the most profound moments in the entire Exodus story. Having been freed from the oppressive chains of slavery in Egypt, they now faced an entirely new challenge, an impassable sea before them and Pharaoh's army closing in from behind. The Israelites had just experienced the most powerful act of deliverance in history. God had sent 10 devastating plagues upon Egypt, culminating in the death of the firstborns, which finally led Pharaoh to release them. They were free at last, but their journey was far from over. Now, standing before the Red Sea, they were confronted with a seemingly insurmountable obstacle. It was as if, after taking a step toward freedom, they were now forced to stand still and face the unknown. This moment, this crossing over the Red Sea, was not just a physical journey. It was a deep spiritual and symbolic moment in the life of the Israelites. Their faith was about to be tested in ways they had never imagined. In that moment of crisis, they were asked to trust God's plan, even when the way forward seemed impossible. The Israelites found themselves at a literal dead end. With the Egyptian army closing in on them, there seemed to be no way out, no way forward. All they had was the God who had brought them this far, and their faith in his ability to make a way where there was no way. It is in these moments of seeming hopelessness that God often calls us to step into the unknown. The Red Sea is not just a geographical location. It is a metaphor for the seasons in our lives when we face impossible situations. Times when we feel as though we have reached the end of our road, and there is no solution in sight. Like the Israelites, we are often confronted with moments where it seems like we have no choice but to turn back, to go back to the way things were, because the future ahead feels too uncertain, too risky, and too daunting. But it is in these very moments that God shows his power and proves his faithfulness. In the face of the Red Sea, God's command was clear. Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. God was telling the Israelites that their fear and anxiety were not necessary. What was required of them in this moment was not strength, not a perfect plan, but faith. Faith in the God who had led them out of Egypt and would lead them into the Promised Land. When we are faced with our own Red Seas, our own moments of fear and uncertainty, God's message is the same. Stand firm. Trust me. I will make a way. The crossing of the Red Sea is one of the most remarkable displays of divine intervention in the Bible. God instructed Moses to stretch out his staff over the waters, and in an instant, the sea parted. A path was made through the waters, and the Israelites were able to walk across on dry land, while the waters stood as walls on either side. This was not a natural phenomenon. It was a supernatural miracle, a demonstration of God's absolute control over the forces of nature. In this moment, God revealed that he was not just a deliverer from Egypt. He was the Lord over every circumstance, every obstacle, every barrier in their lives. As the Israelites walked through the parted sea, they were not just moving from one side to the other, they were crossing into a new identity. They were no longer slaves in Egypt. They were now free people, chosen by God to fulfill a divine purpose. The Red Sea represented a transition from one state of being to another. It was not just a physical crossing, it was a spiritual crossing, an act of faith that marked a new chapter in their relationship with God. They were crossing from the bondage of Egypt into the wilderness, and eventually, into the Promised Land. The Red Sea experience is also a powerful reminder of God's timing. As the Israelites reached the water's edge, they could have never known that God had already prepared the way. His plan was already in motion, even though they couldn't see it. Often in our own lives, we find ourselves facing a Red Sea, unable to see the way forward, unable to understand how God could possibly move in our situation. But just as He made a way for the Israelites, He will make a way for us. Sometimes we need to take the first step of faith before the path becomes clear. Just as the Israelites had to step into the water before it parted, we too must trust God and step into the unknown, knowing that He is faithful to make a way. As the Israelites crossed through the Red Sea, they experienced something that no one could have anticipated, a supernatural deliverance that left them in awe of God's power. The waters were not just parted, they were held back by the hand of God, protecting His people as they walked through. When the Egyptian army tried to follow them, God closed the waters upon them, drowning Pharaoh's forces. This act was a clear sign that God not only made a way for His people, but also protected them from those who sought to bring them back into bondage. For the Israelites, the Red Sea was a defining moment, one that would shape their identity for generations to come. It was the moment they truly understood that God was their deliverer, that they could trust Him, even when the path ahead seemed impossible. The Red Sea was not just a physical crossing, it was a spiritual crossing into a new relationship with God, one that would define their future and destiny. And for us, the Red Sea moment serves as a reminder that no matter what we face in life, God is always able to make a way. When the obstacles seem insurmountable and the future is uncertain, we can trust that God will part the waters and lead us through to the other side. The wilderness, transformation through trials. After the Israelites crossed the Red Sea and left Egypt behind, they found themselves in the wilderness, a barren and desolate land. It must have felt like an endless stretch of uncertainty, a place where everything familiar had been left behind and the future was unknown. Though they had been freed from physical slavery, their spiritual transformation was just beginning. The wilderness was not merely a geographic location, it was a powerful symbol of the trials, tests, and challenges that would shape the people of Israel into the nation God intended them to be. What the Israelites didn't realize at the time was that the wilderness was not a punishment, but a necessary part of their journey. It was a place where they would be refined, tested, and transformed. In the wilderness, the Israelites experienced a series of trials that tested their faith, their patience, and their trust in God. Almost immediately, they began to complain. They were thirsty, hungry, and uncomfortable. The conditions were harsh, and their hopes for a life of ease and abundance were not being realized as quickly as they had imagined. They longed for the comforts of Egypt. Even though Egypt represented their oppression and bondage, they began to forget that God had just delivered them in a powerful way from the hands of Pharaoh. In their discontent, they questioned God's plan and His ability to provide for them in the wilderness. But this was exactly where God wanted them to be. The wilderness was not a place of abandonment, but a place of preparation. It was in the wilderness that God would prove to them that He was not just a God who rescued them from Egypt. He was a God who would sustain them in every trial, a God who would provide for them and guide them through even the most difficult circumstances. Each trial they faced was a lesson in trust, in dependence, and in the realization that God was always present, even when they couldn't see the way forward. For 40 years, the Israelites wandered in the wilderness, and during this time, they learned to rely on God in ways they had never had to before. They were fed by manna from heaven and quail from the sky. When they were thirsty, God provided water from a rock. These miracles were not just about satisfying their physical needs. They were about teaching them to trust in God's provision and faithfulness. The wilderness, then, became the crucible in which their character was refined, their dependence on God deepened, and their understanding of His power and provision grew. But the transformation that took place in the wilderness was not instant. It was a gradual process that took time. The Israelites had to learn how to obey God, how to follow His commands, and how to trust in His timing. The wilderness was a place of testing, but it was also a place of growth. Every trial they faced, every challenge they encountered, was an opportunity for them to see God's faithfulness in action. As they journeyed through the wilderness, God was shaping them into a people who could handle the blessings He had promised them. They had to be prepared for the promised land, for the abundance that awaited them, and that preparation could only happen through the trials of the wilderness. In our own lives, the wilderness moments are often the times when we experience our greatest struggles and challenges. These are the times when we feel alone, when our resources seem depleted, and when the promises of God feel far away. But it is in these wilderness seasons that we often experience our greatest spiritual growth. Like the Israelites, we are called to trust God, even when things are hard, to rely on Him when we can't see the way forward, and to believe that He is working, even when we don't understand the process. The wilderness teaches us valuable lessons. It teaches us that God is with us even in the darkest places. It teaches us that His provision is not limited to our understanding of what we need. It is far more expansive, and often comes in ways we don't expect. It teaches us that faith is not just about believing when everything is going well. It's about trusting in God when life is difficult, when everything seems uncertain, and when the promises feel distant. The wilderness also teaches us the importance of perseverance. The Israelites could have given up many times during their journey, but they kept going. Though they complained, they continued to move forward, and in doing so, they experienced God's presence in ways that would have been impossible had they stayed in Egypt. Similarly, we may feel like giving up in the wilderness moments of our own lives, but perseverance is key. It is in those moments of struggle that God shapes us, molds us, and prepares us for the next season of life. The transformation that occurred in the wilderness was a gradual process, but it was essential for the Israelites to become the people God had destined them to be. They needed to learn obedience, trust, and dependence on God, so that they could be ready to enter the promised land. Likewise, the trials we face in our own lives are often preparation for what lies ahead. God uses our wilderness seasons to refine us, to draw us closer to Him, and to equip us for the future He has prepared for us. The wilderness is not the end of the journey, it is part of the journey, a journey that leads to transformation and eventual victory. Ultimately, the wilderness moments in our lives are not to be feared, but embraced, for it is in those moments that we discover the depths of God's provision, the strength of His presence, and the beauty of His transforming power. Just as the Israelites emerged from the wilderness as a nation ready to inherit the promises of God, so too will we emerge from our trials, stronger, wiser, and more equipped to fulfill our divine destiny.